And this is joint work with Adam Carter, Amir Ibrahimi Fard, Peter Clutton, and Colin Klein, who are all listed on the title page there. Here we go. Right, so these are the folks that I just mentioned, all of them allegedly radicalized online, all of them allegedly led to violent extremism via their search patterns, but also by the recommender systems that promoted far-right and radicalizing content to them. And as I said, the Unite the Right rally was partially organized online, and a lot of the participants claim, at least, that they were radicalized online. Perhaps the most extreme example that we were able to find was the case of Bucky Wolf, who is a young man in Seattle who joined the Proud Boys, which is a far-right organization in the States, and spent hours a day on YouTube watching far-right content as well as conspiracy theories, ended up killing his own brother with a sword, and then calling the police and telling them what he had done and saying that he did it because the person that he killed wasn't actually his brother, but was actually a lizard in disguise as his brother. So there are a bunch of anecdotal reports like this, and Wolf's trajectory through YouTube is visible still through his liking patterns. You can actually go to his YouTube channel and see I think it's a 3-year history of his liking. So he started out watching a bunch of music, and then he got into sort of toxic masculinity, firearms, far-right politics. And then he got into QAnon. I can explain that to anyone who is not familiar with the conspiracy theory, but if you've heard of Pizzagate, this is sort of the successor to the Pizzagate conspiracy theory. And then he got into stuff about shapeshifters and reptilians. The reptilian conspiracy theory is a fairly old one. It's been around for about 30 years. It was first promoted by David Icke. The basic idea is that the world is actually run by sentient reptiles that are the size of humans and disguise themselves as humans. And that's what Bucky Wolf referenced when he first, when he stabbed his brother and then called the police about it. So what we wanted to do was figure out whether YouTube is actually doing this to people, or whether it's more of a scare, whether it's a real problem that YouTube needs to take into account and that needs to be regulated by policymakers and government, or whether it's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. And we thought that this would be an important thing to do because this kind of phenomenon has been talked about as if it's well documented for years now. So for instance, Zeynep Tufekci, who's an associate professor studying media and politics in the States, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times over 2 years ago, calling YouTube the great radicalizer. And William Chaslow was an engineer at YouTube who was ousted for blowing the whistle on what he claimed, at least, was the problems with the YouTube algorithm promoting conspiracy theories and radicalizing people. So there's a lot of discourse about how YouTube might be doing this, but no systematic investigation, and that's what we set out to do in this study. It seems like it's a relevant thing to do because there's some evidence that, for instance, conspiracy theories about COVID-19 are now spreading on YouTube. There's conspiracy theory about Bill Gates trying to microchip people with a vaccine that's spread on YouTube and elsewhere. And this has led even to in-person protests. For instance, there was an in-person protest of several hundred people in Melbourne last month in Australia, calling for the arrest of Bill Gates for trying to sneakily put microchips in people via a potential vaccine for COVID. So it seemed like something that we would want to know about if it's really happening, but that hadn't been investigated properly yet. Now, you might wonder why we focus on the recommender system. So you might think, well, clearly somebody like Bucky Wolf, who spends hours a day on YouTube, has a sword, uses the sword to kill his brother, and then calls the police and tells them what he's done, is mentally disturbed in certain ways. And why would we blame the recommender system when it's clearly something about his individual psychology? That's a fair point, but I think that perhaps a more nuanced way of putting it is that both individual factors such as personality and character on the one hand, and technological and social factors such as recommender systems that are trained on human watching data might be playing a role together and conspire and sort of working together to radicalize some at-risk or vulnerable populations. And what I'm showing you here is a teaser for another paper that I'm working on with Marco Meyer and Badawine de Brown, where we showed that people who are simultaneously both indifferent to the truth and rigid in their belief structures, so unwilling to update their beliefs in light of new evidence, score very high on belief in COVID misinformation. It's in fact the strongest predictor of COVID misinformation out of over a dozen variables that we tested for. So we think that individual variables matter, but we also think that those things interact with social and technological things to produce the outcomes that we're seeing in the world. So the framework that we use to describe and sort of analyze this is what we called in a previous paper technological seduction. And we call it that because we're following John Forrester's 1990 book, where he argues that the first step in a seductive maneuver could be summed up as, I know what you're thinking. And what we think recommender systems do essentially is implicitly say to people or suggest to people that Google or YouTube or Alphabet or Facebook or whatever it might be knows what they're thinking. And that when people accept that attribution, then they can actually end up changing their thinking based on that suggestion, based on that sort of seductive maneuver. And that can play out in a variety of ways. So it could be something like, I know that you're thinking that some proposition is true, but it could also be, I know that you think that this is the most important categories when it comes to the news. So sort of agenda setting rather than expressing propositions. Or it could be a matter of associations between concepts or phenomena. And we think that all of these occur on online platforms. In the previous paper, we distinguished two different varieties of technological seduction. So one is sort of more intentional, we call it top-down, and it has to do with things like the menu structure on the New York Times website, or the semantic tags that are appended to stories that tell people, hey, if you're interested in this story, you probably want to see that story as well. And that's all done intentionally. The other type is what we called bottom-up exacerbation. And this has to do, this is derived from things like supervised learning on biased data or unsupervised learning on actual human behavior. And that's essentially what this project is investigating. So briefly, top-down seduction has to do with sort of editorial choices by, for instance, news agencies like the New York Times and Breitbart and Fox News. Here's a map of all of the topics talked about on Breitbart during the year 2016. And you can see, essentially, it's just a list of threats. So at the bottom left in green, you've got the sort of migration crisis. Next to that in pink, you've got ISIS. Below that, you've got the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you go up to the top right, you've got stuff about the border between the United States and Mexico. Basically, all Breitbart talked about in 2016 was threats. And in this book, Network Propaganda by Benkler and colleagues, they show that Breitbart actually set the agenda for the entire 2016 presidential election. So they had quite a strong effect. And that's the sort of top-down thing where somebody like Steve Bannon decides to set the agenda. But what we wanted to know was, can it happen sort of more organically or as an emergent phenomenon based on people's interactions with a platform such as YouTube? And the way that we're thinking this might work is based on what we call the erotetic theory of reasoning. This is a theory that is due to Philip Corliss. I've worked with Philip on a follow-up paper on it where we argue that moral reasoning works in the same way as non-moral reasoning. And the basic idea with erotetic, that's just Greek for having to do with questions. Basic idea is that reasoning is the process of asking questions and answering them. And it's a path-dependent and iterative procedure because the question you ask second may depend on the answer you get to your first question. And the question you ask third may depend on the answer you get to your second question, and so on and so forth. And what we think of these platforms as doing is essentially usurping people's questioning and answering capacity by, in the one instance, telling them what question or query to run, and then also giving them the answer to that query. So here's what that might look like. If you go to Google and type in, "why are women?" it'll tell you the 5 questions that you should ask. And the 5 questions you should ask are, why are women colder than men? Why are women so mean? Why are women voting for Trump? Why are women so emotional? And why are they always cold? And then if you decide, oh, okay, I guess that is the question I want to ask, then Google will also give you an answer. And it might be, for instance, this, which is what I found when I ran this search a few years ago. Essentially misogynistic, self-congratulatory guy who calls himself Conceptual Clarity and is male between the age of 51 and 55. Or for instance, if you go to Google and type in, "is Black lives?" then it'll tell you that the query you want to run is Black Lives Matter racist? Or is Black Lives Matter violent, or a hate group, or an interest group? And when I ran this suggested query a few years ago, the top result was what you see here from truthrevolt.org, which is a propaganda website. So what we're thinking is that when you're on YouTube, when you're on Google, when you're in various other platforms, people will start out by running queries. Those queries might end up being shaped by predictive text, by predictive analytics. And then the answers to those queries will then be supplied by the same platform. So if you think that reasoning is the process of asking questions and answering them, then essentially what ends up happening is the platform gives you your question, or at least shapes your question sometimes, and then also gives you the answer to that question. And that will in turn determine, or at least influence the question that you ask subsequently, and the answer to that question, and the question you ask subsequent to that, and the answer to that question, and so on. So this would be pretty troubling if you thought that people need to engage in their own autonomous moral reasoning rather than having that sort of supplied to them by a for-profit platform. And this isn't just something that we came up with. This is actually how YouTube themselves talk about what they've done. So back in 2011, they changed the way that their recommender system worked. And their goal was to tell people what they wanted, essentially. So you can see here Jim McFadden saying, "We wanted to serve the needs of people when they didn't know what they were looking for." Essentially, YouTube was designed to tell people, this is what you want. This is and then to get them to accept that. And it was a wildly successful business venture. So prior to 2011, most views on YouTube were derived from search or links. But subsequent to the changes that they made in the algorithm, over 70% of watch time is now based on the recommender system, right? So the vast majority of the time that people spent on YouTube is based on YouTube's own recommendations. And what they did in 2011 was to switch from a model that optimized on a basket of different variables, such as mouse over, click through, and so on, and instead focus entirely on optimizing for watch through. And what I mean by that is they tried to recommend to people videos that they were likely to watch all the way to the end. Now, why would you do that? Well, if your business model is surveillance capitalism and selling ads, selling advertisements, then what you really want to do is ensure that people spend as much time watching videos on your platform as possible so that you can serve them as many ads as possible, right? So YouTube wasn't trying to radicalize people, but what they ended up doing was trying to recommend to people things that they would watch through all the way to the end, so that they would then get the next video and watch that to the end, and get the next video and watch that to the end. And it turns out that the sort of thing that captures people's attention and keeps people's attention is stuff like conspiracy theories and radicalizing content. So as a side effect of the business model, essentially, YouTube has ended up promoting a bunch of conspiracy theories so that they can sell ads. So here's how we tried to investigate that systematically. We took a bunch of topics that Bucky Wolf was interested in, like martial arts, firearms, and gurus like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. And then we added a few other topics that we thought might result in radicalizing content. So anti-vaxxers are into natural foods, so we thought maybe we would look for natural foods. And then we tried to find something that was a bit more sort of left-wing, so we went with tiny houses, which are like essentially fancy trailers. And we operationalized each topic with a bunch of search terms. So 6 topics, 5 search terms per topic. And we then set up a robot to watch the top recommended videos for each of those search terms, and then to watch automatically, electronically, watch each of the top 5 recommended videos off of each of those, and then each of the top 5 recommended videos off of that second stage, and each of the top 5 off the third stage, and so on. So we went 5 layers deep, branching 5 ways each time for, in the end, 30 different terms. I'm going to pause for a second and just make sure that everyone's following what I'm describing here. Does that branching structure make sense? Any questions? Sounds like no. Okay. So hopefully that's sensible. Here's another picture of what it looks like. So the root is one of those 30 search terms. And for each root, we got 5 search results. And then for each of those results, we got 5 more. And for each of those results, we got 5 more, resulting in over 100,000 clips. Now, in order to investigate this systematically, we had to actually watch some of these videos. And we weren't going to watch all 100,000 of them because that would take forever. So what we did was we found the ones that were the most recommended as ranked by PageRank, which is an algorithm that I can describe in more detail later if people are interested. And we took the top 100 clips for each topic. So as I said, there's 6 different topics, each with 5 search terms. We get the top 100 clips for each of those 6 topics. And 3 people, myself included, watched all 600 of those clips. It took a long time. Here's a similarity matrix of the videos at the topic level. And essentially what this shows is if you started out by watching a clip about fitness, how likely is it that you end up watching a video that's also recommended at some point by the martial arts searches? Or if you start out by watching a clip about natural foods, how likely is it that you end up seeing a clip that's also recommended by firearms? And what you can see here is that fitness, so darker means more similarity, fitness is pretty closely related to martial arts, which I think makes a certain amount of sense. And tiny homes is fairly closely related to natural foods, which makes a certain amount of sense. The gurus were most closely associated with natural foods. We were slightly puzzled by that, but then we realized that Jordan Peterson has a side hustle where he promotes an all beef diet, like literally eating nothing but beef, and talks about it in terms of natural food. So that's probably the explanation for that similarity. Here's a similarity matrix, not at the topic level, but at the search term level. And this essentially helps us to see to what extent the topics as we operationalize them are unified. So what we can see here is that if you search any of these tiny home terms, like tiny house, tiny home, off the grid, micro compact home, you're very likely to get something else that's recommended by another tiny home search term. Similarly, if you search for one of these gurus' names, you're very likely to end up getting recommended a video that's similar to one of the other videos recommended in the guru category. Guns, similar. The least unified were the martial arts and fitness, actually. Okay, so that's that. Now, among the top 600 videos, here are some example titles, just so you can get an idea of where you would end up if you let YouTube guide your watching. So if you start out watching something in the martial arts category, you get things like the 20 most embarrassing moments in sports, but you also get the Gracie UFC conspiracy. I didn't know what that one was until I watched it, and it's not a conspiracy theory like the lizard people. It's more about like advertising within the martial arts community. If you start out in fitness, you get a TED Talk. There's actually a lot of TED Talks among the most common videos. But you also get things about a keto diet and chest exercises. If you start out in firearms, you get a bunch of stuff about firearms. So you can see a lot of these are sort of clickbaity. There's a lot of all caps, exclamation points, things like that. But some of them are pretty obviously conspiracy theories. So the revelation of the pyramids is about how the pyramids weren't actually built by Egyptians, but by aliens. But a lot of them, let's see, we've also got Proven Biblical Money Principles and The Strangest Secret in the World by Earl Nightingale. These were conspiracy theories. So some of them are, some of them aren't. We did a topic model on the transcripts of the 600 most recommended clips and essentially found that if you're looking at the firearms videos, you're going to see stuff about guns, shooting, triggers, rounds, and pistols. If you start out in the tiny homes category, you're likely to watch clips that have words in them like house, just, tiny space, really. So these are fairly sensible, I think. If you start out watching clips about martial arts, you'll see stuff that says like words like fight, fighter, punch, athlete, and hand. But some of them are maybe a little bit surprising. So the gurus category, there's essentially two kinds of clips there. There's your sort of Joe Rogan clips where a lot of curse words, and then there's your sort of rhetorical or epistemic clips, which are about people knowing things and saying things. And that's actually somewhat surprising because there's no actual content here. This is all sort of rhetorical gesturing and posturing. So next is a look at the discovery level of the videos with different labels. Essentially, sorry, let me skip that and come back to it. Here's the main slide. So this slide represents the ratings that each of the clips, the 600 clips, received from 3 independent raters. Our level of agreement was okay, but not excellent. So Fleece's kappa was 0.455, but it was statistically significant. And we rated the videos in 4 different ways. So in some cases, the clip was just no longer available. And that could be for any number of reasons, like copyright violation, but also violation of the terms of service, or the clip could have just been deleted by its owner. Lots of ways a clip becomes unavailable. But then the ones that were actually visible, we gave them a 1 if there was no conspiracy theorizing in the clip at all. We gave them a 2 if the clip involved some kind of suggestion that powerful forces either do or try to influence the topic of the video. So that's a sort of mild conspiracy theory. And we gave the clip a 3 if it said both that powerful forces do or try to influence the topic of the video, and that they systematically distort the evidence about their own activities. And we distinguished 2 and 3 in this way because our previous research suggests that the most pernicious conspiracy theories, the ones that are hardest to get people to give up once they've accepted them, are the ones that involve this distortion of evidence type of claim. And you can see why that would be, because once you build that into your conspiracy theory, it becomes essentially unfalsifiable. If you find evidence that is consistent with the conspiracy theory, then you can treat that as just direct evidence that it's right. But if you find evidence that's inconsistent with the conspiracy theory, then you can say, see, but that just shows that they're conspiring against us and distorting the evidence. So whether you get evidence that's consistent with or inconsistent with the conspiracy theory, you can always treat it as confirmation. And that makes it extremely difficult to disabuse people of that kind of belief. Now, what we see here is that if you start watching videos about tiny homes, the vast majority of the videos that you end up seeing have no conspiratorial content in them. And if you watch fitness videos or martial arts videos, you don't see that many. If you watch natural foods and firearms videos, you start to see a few, but still not that many. But if you start watching these guru videos, you see an astonishing number of conspiracy theory promoting content clips. So the one category here is only about half of all 100 videos that are most recommended for the guru's content. And in fact, the 3s outnumber the 2s, meaning that the more virulent type of conspiracy theory is more common among these highly promoted videos than the less virulent type of conspiracy theory. I'm going to go back to these and walk you through this. So this is the discovery level of videos with a label of 1. And what that means is, as I said before, we go through 5 stages of branching. And these are videos with a label of 1, so no conspiratorial content. And what you see is that you end up with gurus no matter where you start, essentially. So the gurus are the dark black here. Once you get to level 5, every video is a guru video, no matter where you started. Similarly with the ones with label 2. So these are the ones that are mildly conspiratorial, but don't involve claims about distortion of evidence. With these, you get to the gurus even faster. And with level 3, the most virulent type of conspiracy theories, you get to the gurus almost immediately and you stay there. So it's a sort of gravity sink. It's pulling people's attention. No matter what they start out interested in, they end up watching videos of gurus, half of which are conspiratorial. So here's a numeric rather than visual summary of what I just said. So the ratio of conspiratorial clips to all clips that we rated for the 6 different topics is displayed in this table. And nearly half of the guru videos are conspiratorial, whereas only about 3% of the tiny house videos are conspiratorial. So that seems like a real problem. It's the first systematic effort to investigate the YouTube recommender system for promoting conspiracy theories. And the anecdotal reports seem to be borne out, meaning that the recommender system really does push people towards conspiracy theories. And it does so differentially based on the topic that they start out interested in. So we end the paper by coming up with some recommendations for the actors in this space. In the first instance, we have some recommendations for individuals, namely to cultivate relevant epistemic virtues and eschew relevant epistemic vices, because we have some evidence that that is one factor that results in people finding this kind of content credible. But another thing that people on their own can do is to reset defaults in their browsers. So for instance, turning off predictive text so that your queries are not determined or shaped by the recommender system, and turning off autoplay so that if you're on YouTube and you finish a clip, you don't automatically end up watching the next one just because autoplay is turned on, which is the default setting. For industry, we think that really the problem is the business model, because if your main goal is to sell as many ads as possible, then you need to capture people's attention and keep it. And the only way to stop that is to change the business model. That could mean switching to something like a subscription model. It could mean just government regulation that forces these companies not to optimize their recommender systems in this way. And we have a number of other recommendations for industry, including training algorithms to flag conspiracy theories. And that's work that is ongoing with my colleague Michal Klinsevich. So essentially, we're training natural language processing algorithms to tag videos as conspiratorial or as promoting conspiracy theories, so that they can then be defunded, so that they can't sell ads on top of them. And then the last bit is for regulators, policymakers, and legislators. We don't think that industry is really capable of self-regulating, especially because things like YouTube, as well as search and social networking platforms, tend to be natural monopolies, and then to abuse that natural monopoly power. So I think that essentially regulators need to get involved and stop these companies from doing this kind of stuff. And the other main recommendation for regulators and policymakers is to institute education for epistemic virtues and against epistemic vices in schools and universities. And I think that's it. I spoke maybe a little too quickly, but hopefully that was interesting. And thank you very much for your time.